Good evening. Welcome to the Friday New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate. And we're going to be talking tonight a little bit about the difference between the British system and the American system and why the American Revolution was necessary and why we were right to have a revolution against the British Empire. And I have to say, as we were organizing for this discussion this evening, my colleague Suzanne Klebe and I discovered that apparently it is now a controversial topic to say that there was ever any disagreement between the British and the United States. I find that most alarming. I think it is not only a result of the recent cancel culture, but it is a result of efforts by co-sympathizers of this system of a British liberal free trade, um, their legacy, which has never been completely rooted out in the United States, or should I say, we have not fully liberated ourselves from the imperial outlook of man, although that was the intent of our nation. So we clearly have some work to do, and I'm very happy tonight to be joined by several people. We can bring them all up who know something about this fight. We have Michael Spinner, who is the vice president of the Society of Old Brooklynites, who will be sharing with us some things about the British during the Revolution, the prison ships, and otherwise. We have Christopher Fogarty, who wrote a book called Ireland 1845 through 1850, The Perfect Holocaust and Who Kept It Perfect, who also, from an Irish perspective, Irish American perspective, knows something about the British Empire. And I have my colleague Joel DeJean, who is now filed in Texas as an independent LaRouche candidate in the new 38th congressional district. There's not an incumbent there because of the census and the redistricting. So if that's that's the district we lost from New York, then I would be very hopeful that Joel would get into the Congress. That would make it worth it. Now, I will say, as always, that participation in the Sare for Senate Symposium does not constitute endorsement of my candidacy or any particular candidacy. And participants will be expressing their own views, I hope. And that's what makes us wonderful. And I may or may not agree with everything presented here, but obviously, as I said already about this situation of the history of the United States, our battle with the British Empire and that ideology, these are urgent matters that need to be discussed. So with that, now I have a few things to say by way of introduction, and then we'll get into the show. What I wanted to say, first of all, is that this time of year, Thanksgiving through Christmas or the end of the year, uh, always evokes in me a certain sense of history, of reverence for the founding of the United States. Thanksgiving, the celebration, first of the Pilgrims, later the beautiful Thanksgiving Day Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, written in the middle of the so-called Civil War, better called War of the Rebellion, and what our purpose was. And people knew that early on, as Lyndon LaRouche often would cite Nicholas of Cusa, Leibniz, other European philosophers whose work directly resulted in the creation of this republic. They knew that in Europe you had still too much of an oligarchical system of dukes and duchies and kingdoms, and people were very stuck. It was very unusual for a person to be able to leave the caste or the career of their father and forefathers, and there were all kinds of persecutions, including religious persecution, so that people believed that they had to go somewhere else to start afresh, to create a system ultimately, as Cusa was writing about early in the Concordantia Catholica, the question of the consent of the governed. If human beings are created equally in the image of God, then what gives one human being the right to rule over another one? That is not a natural right that has to do with your bloodline or how much money you have or something, but that right can be granted by the consent of the governed. This was a very profound idea, a real breakthrough, and Ben Franklin and others of the founding fathers knew it would be quite a challenge. So when we threw off the British, how do you create a system that allows for the development, and what is freedom? And I think today there's a great confusion about what freedom means. Is freedom the right to do whatever you want with your body? Is that why we had a revolution? I would say not. I think Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms get much closer to the point: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. If you think about certain situations in the world today, where in Afghanistan we have now left, but the Federal Reserve is still holding $9.2 billion from the Afghan central bank, refusing to release it because we don't like the Taliban, supposedly. Well, it's likely that if nothing is done, 23 million people in that country are going to starve or freeze to death this winter. And by withholding these funds, what we are doing is driving them back into the arms of terrorists and opium. If someone is truly desperate, maybe they will decide they should start selling the weapons that were left there by the American and NATO troops. Maybe they will go back to opium production. The major opposition now to the Taliban is ISIS. So what are we benefiting by starving the population and putting people into such a position of desperation that it's been reported that some people are literally selling their children to get money for food? It's a horrific situation, and you have similar situations around the world. So in that regard, the United States at the moment is acting like the British Empire did. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit is one of our most important founders, namely, let's see here. Yes, this character, whom I hope you recognize, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote a very, very important paper on the subject of manufactures. And I'll just say, as people may be aware, he was born actually in the Caribbean, was recognized to be quite a genius, was sent here, ended up at what is now Princeton, and became really the right-hand man of George Washington. And I have to say, I think Hamilton was a complete genius because he had witnessed the atrocities of the British and Dutch slave trade on the sugar plantations, where the slavery was, if you can imagine, even more brutal and barbaric than it was here, that slaves on these sugar plantations would often not even live for a year. So to come here and think, how do you create a republic, and how do you create an economic system which allows that republic to be fully independent? And what he did when he became the first Treasury Secretary was he wrote a series of papers, one of which on the subject of manufactures in 1791 was absolutely crucial, because he makes the point that part of freedom is to be free from the necessity of scrounging for food or comfort or a warm house or these kind of things. And there was a big debate whether agriculture or industry were superior. And he said, well, they're really quite intertwined, but it is manufacturing and scientific breakthroughs that allow human beings to multiply, as he said, the objects of the human mind, but to actually multiply your resources. So contrary to Parson Thomas Malthus of the British East India Company, who said that population grows geometrically, but resources only arithmetically, Hamilton already had proven that your resources can be increased geometrically, but you have to have an economic policy that does that. And this, Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away in 2019, was probably not only the greatest student of Alexander Hamilton, but advanced the work of Alexander Hamilton in the field of what you could call physical economy. And LaRouche made in his career 9 major economic forecasts. He was not wrong on any of them. Sometimes things took longer to collapse, as we see today, because of their miraculous ability to hyperinflate the bubble of speculation. So now I would like to go to Henry Carey, who was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And in case people think that I'm exaggerating or that people didn't know there was a difference, this is from Carey's Harmony of Interests. Very, very explicit. He says, 2 systems are before the world. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks toward universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is the true mission of these people of the United States. To them has been granted a privilege never before granted to man, that of the exercise of the right of perfect self-government. But as rights and duties are inseparable, with the grant of the former came the obligation to perform the latter. Rights and duties, right? So very beautiful, very, very clear. Now, this is from Parson Thomas Malthus of the British East India Company, and you might reflect on certain conditions we see around the world, like what I described in Afghanistan, or what we see being imposed on people in the United States, like the residents of NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, who have lead in their water, can't get their ventilation fixed, spend coldest months of the year with no gas, etc. And here is what Malthus says explicitly, quote, all children who are born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish unless room be made for them by the death of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread this too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Now, Lyndon LaRouche warned 50 years ago that the policies of the Rockefellers, the policies of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank would cause new pandemics to emerge, because when you degrade the standard of living and you weaken people's immune systems, that's what you get. And obviously, this was already known in 1798 and promoted by Malthus. Now, last, I just want to show this video, which is a little bit of a map of what the British were up to at the time, leading into the American Revolution and later into the 1840s when they ran the Opium Wars against China.
The slavery system, destroying the southern United States, was a
Whoops.
critical part of a worldwide British economic system to which Adam Smith gave the name free trade. Beginning in West Africa, the British East India Company, Royal Africa Company, and others captured slaves. These slaves were shipped to the Western Hemisphere to create the slave plantation system of the southern United States. The principal product of this system in the 19th century was cotton, 75% of which was exported to England. Here, English peasants worked for shillings to turn the cotton into low-quality textiles, which were then sold in India, the crown jewel of the empire. The Indian subjects, denied the right by the British to produce themselves, paid for the textiles with opium crops. The Indian opium was then shipped from India to China, where it was forced on the Chinese people for enormous profit, addicting millions to the life-sucking drug. The profits from this cycle, characterized by East India Company lackey Adam Smith as buying cheap and selling dear, was the foundation of the empire's existence. An interruption of any one part was an interruption to the whole.
In dealing with vulgar-minded bullies, and such unfortunately the people of the United States are, nothing is gained by submission to insult and wrong. The U.S. have no navy of which we need be afraid, and they might be told that if they were to resort to privateering, we should, however reluctantly, be obliged to retaliate by burning all their seacoast towns.
So I think that's gives a good idea. Now I just want to quickly go through a couple other things. Let's see. Oh, shoot. Go. This is a picture of the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. By this time, the United States was by far the most productive economy on the planet. The largest locomotive ever built was in this as an exhibit, powering. They had a belt which was powering with this giant steam engine, the other exhibits that needed power. But not only that, the standard of living of the American people was the highest in the world. And Frederick Douglass describes, again, the difference between the British slave system of the South and the North. He said when he escaped from slavery and got to the North, he was sure that the people in the North would have a very poor standard of living because they didn't have people waiting on them hand and foot. But what he discovered, as Hamilton had said about manufacturers, is that machines can do physical work much more powerfully and efficiently than human beings. There's a physical limit to what a human body can do, but as you make scientific breakthroughs, machines can do incredible things. So he was quite shocked to find that the standard of living in the North was much higher than in the South. And this is also why it is not true that the United States would have become a great economy had we been based on slavery and slave labor. Now, people from all over the world visited this exposition. It was the first time that a head of state from anywhere had come here. We were still controversial for having beaten the British. And the first foreign head of state to visit was the Emperor of Brazil, believe it or not. But they wanted to take this American system to other parts of the world, hence the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, which was blown up by Lawrence of Arabia, and very importantly, a plan to develop the southern part of the Americas, held by certain presidents, very importantly, Garfield and McKinley, both of whom were assassinated. And the last thing I just want to show is there was an incredible effort to crush this American system, universal, because you can call it American system, but it's a universal conception of the nature of man, which led to a series of assassinations and ultimately into World War I. And that was the time when there was a huge shift in the United States. We were not to say anything bad about the British. And I think was a major contributing factor to the confusion that Americans have today. But just look at this. assassinations. 1865, President Abraham Lincoln is assassinated before the troops have even come back from winning the war. In April of 1881, Tsar Alexander II, who was a great friend of the United States, who sent the Russian Navy to the harbors of San Francisco and New York to join the war on the side of the Union, on the side of Abraham Lincoln, if the British recognized the South. He's assassinated. 1881, American President Garfield, again a strong advocate of American system economics, assassinated. In France, the engineer, the leader and what became the École Polytechnique, Sadi Carnot, is assassinated. In 1890, the Chancellor of Prussia, or sort of Germany, is thrown out, creating conditions for war. And then in 1901, President William McKinley is assassinated, paving the way for Teddy Roosevelt and then ultimately Woodrow Wilson. So this is a lot of assassinations in a short time, and had a very, very devastating result on American history and on where we are today. And we have a real fight at this moment because, given the current state of affairs with this gigantic financial bubble that we've been bailing out at all costs, I am afraid if Americans don't actually figure out what the mission of our republic is supposed to be and recognize the philosophy which has led to this mess and against which we had the revolution, I think the world is in great danger. So with that, I'd like now to turn to Michael Spinner to share with us what you have on these matters.
Yeah, that was a wonderful speech. I really liked that dialogue. And I can say that you have a lot of intuitive thought on Malthus and was it was such a difficult time and during the American Revolution, which that's I'm schooled in, that it was a different mindset between the British citizens or the British royalty and their citizenship and the American or colonists, as they called them. They looked at Americans or colonists as less of a person. It's kind of like the Southerners looked at their slaves. We had taxation without representation. We were treated horribly and with cruelty. But as soon as anyone that was being tortured or treated horribly would say that they were a British citizen, they would be completely turned around and put into very, very nice accommodations. Now, if I have a chance to tell you about how the invasion of New York happened, and that's what I'm supposed to be here for. That's what I was told. If I can get Fig A, the map, you can see New York itself, and you can see where Staten Island is, where the Narrows are. Through that whole area, the British landed the largest amphibious invasion to date, almost 30,000 troops against Washington's 5,000 troops. The British wanted to hold on to the colonies so dearly. They saw the potential. We were a British asset, as we still are a British asset through World War I and World War II. We were a British asset, and as you said, we were appeasing the British or trying to keep them at bay, even through the Spanish-American War, where the British had the largest navy, and our navy was a fledgling navy fighting a navy that was on the decline, the Spanish Navy. And if the British would have stepped in even a slight bit, we would have been a completely different war between the Spanish and the Americans. So now, if you look at the map, the British moved up further towards the East River, where you see the British colonies, the British Army lines go right into where you have Fort Greene and Wallabout Bay, where the Fort Greene Monument is, where the prison martyred ships are. And Washington had to leave. He had to flee. He got lucky, or there was some sort of agreement that he could escape. Because if Washington would have not escaped, he would have been captured. That would have been the end of the Revolutionary War. He traversed the East River, then went through the island of Manhattan and then traversed the Hudson River and got away. Most of his troops got away. A Maryland 500 were captured. A bunch of were captured. 1,800 were captured and put on prison ships. Also, through the 6 years of the war, the British had New York. But that was a thorn in the side of the British because they always had to keep it guarded. If you look at the Manhattan Island, you see the red lines around it. That's where the troops of General Howard stationed all through that whole area. And it was quite a few divisions, and they couldn't operate in the field. Also across Staten Island, they were there. Now, after the war, when we found out, if you can go to Fig, actually, let's go back to the prison ship. If you go to Fig B, inside the prison ships, these Americans were kept in horrible conditions. In this picture here of the British soldier with his brown vest and the bayonet attached, which the brown vest at the time was the most advanced fighting equipment that anyone could ever have, and a bayonet. That picture really doesn't depict the actual. Go to the next pic C. It was more like that in the thing. If you go to pick D, and there's another picture of that's more a depiction of what their men look like. But they were so grouped together. You would chained to a guy who had typhoid, and the British would give them smallpox and then send them home. But if all these men, if they were to pledge allegiance to the British crown, they could have been let go in a day or two. But they didn't. They did it for the millions yet unborn, for us. So go to the next pic of the Fort Greene Monument. That's the Fort Greene Monument, 148-foot high Doric column that was put together by the Society of Old Brooklynites, the DAR, and matching funds from Congress at the time. And 50,000 people came there in 1908 to open this, to commemorate this. But no one really knows what it is today. That's a shame, because the British are not our friends. We're one of their assets. They use us for whatever they need, and they can trick us into, as you say. So I think that's about all I have to say about the war. But you got to remember, the British mindset was, we're better than you. You're not worth anything. Why are we? That's why they even called us the derogatory term of Yanks. It's really not the nicest thing to call somebody back in the day, but there was a song called Yankee Doodle Dandy that the British came up with, but we, at Battle of Saratoga, we used it against them. It was a funny joke that we kind of turned on them. So basically, that's all I have to say about the war, but I can go further on other things. But let me stop now and hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. Good. I have some questions for you about that, but let's go to Chris Fogarty and then Joel, and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
Here is a photograph of Queen Victoria in her, or am I not? In Queen Victoria, of her inaugural meeting with her cabinet. The men in the background are her cabinet. One of those men it was just mentioned by you earlier, Diane, and they were all Englishmen who owned land. They were landlords of Ireland. It was they who enslaved the Irish, and they tried to set up their system in the United States. They had done that. That was partly what the war was about. That is in this book of the correspondence, Queen Victoria's early letters. She was guided by Leopold I of Belgium, and he chose many of her in her cabinet, and he chose for her husband. So while he's mentored Queen Victoria ever since she was a princess and a very young girl, something like 8 years of age when he started meeting with her and corresponding with her. He was her uncle. He guided her. He mentored her throughout her youth, and he also mentored, obviously, his son, Leopold II. Queen Victoria murdered 5.2 million people in Ireland, and his son, Leopold II, went on to murder some 10 or 11 million people in Belgian Congo. And he was the sole proprietor of Belgian Congo. So that's how he managed. Further along, I'd like to bring up this book, The Prison Ship, Jersey. It's quite a piece of work, and it was that monument that was mentioned earlier. I've been to New York maybe like 15 times. Anytime I've ever gone, I have made a pilgrimage to the monument, the Ship's Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park. There, the sacred remains of those who were murdered, starved to death, or beaten to death at British hands in Wallabout Bay are buried. Their remains were picked up for decades along the Brooklyn shore of the East River. It's a very touching situation. They are true American heroes. But all of this leads... Oh, I must also say that Malthus was mentioned here, and his chief opponent was a William Cobbett, who was a farmer in England, who paid rent to his landlord, his royal connected landlord, and hired agricultural laborers. So he knew what agriculture was all about. He visited Ireland in 1833, and he suggested that they would be free at some stage. They were working 250 to 260 days a year in order to pay their rent for a few acres on which they spent the rest of the year providing for their own families. So again, 250 to 260 days out of 365 were unpaid labor for the local English landlord. There are none remain in Ireland today. They were all bought out by the British government 1900 and 1910. And they were paid out at above market prices, so that my parents and every other farmer in Ireland were paying off that old, quote, debt, unquote, into the 1970s. The amount of money given to those old English landlords for their typically 20,000 acre estates was so far above market that the repayment period was set at 68.5 years. So it extended into the 1970s. And that's when that repayment period ended. William Cobbett, that same man I mentioned, who was a farmer paying rent to a landlord in England and also paying agricultural laborers, he was a British MP, and he described when he was young, having been a member of a British regiment in New Brunswick, Canada, in which the loyalists fleeing what we call New England today, 260,000 of them were kept alive by food extracted at gunpoint from Ireland by the British government. At the end of Cromwell's genocide in 1849 through 1853-4, the survivors of his genocides in Ireland, he filled them into a number of ships and sailed them to Jamaica, and they were the initial. He took Jamaica from the Spanish and turned it into a slave state, a slave colony, and the first slaves there were Irish. I went to school, in fact, with a few who were Irish, Jamaican, part Africans, who had evidently they had mingled their races there. And so, but all this leads me, by the way, William Cobbett was a huge opponent of Malthus and Lord Brougham and the rest of the aristocrats. And from Ireland, he wrote a number of letters, both to his laborer and to other lords in England, to try to get them to become more democratic, to stop their crimes against humanity. But all this leads to, and I won't take up much more time here, but all this leads to this book. It is written, Who We Are. How can I get it into focus? Here we go. Who We Are, Americans Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, Volume 1, 1790s to 1850s, by Anton Chaitkin. It is the most important book I have ever read. He takes up, from you, Diane, the In fact, here's my own blurb on it. This is the most important book I have ever read, a work of immense scholarship. While silent regarding our current plight, it paints the it points the United States and the West toward salvation. It does so by providing specific examples of how and by whom the early United States coped with and largely overcame the forces of empire within. They were the slaveholders, the bankers, the people who tried to keep America a backward country, always indebted to the British crown. So this is Anton Chaitkin. I cannot speak more highly about it. It is absolutely imperative that America read this book because it will provide the salvation for the country. It is truly brilliant and absolutely to the point of where we are today and where we came from. And when we had a situation similar to today in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, under the new America, the new United States, the forces for British domination, slavery, and control were within the United States. They're named by author Chaitkin, and those who stood up and imposed the American system, managed to make the American system the operative one in the United States, they're also named. And how they did it, it stands as a means by which we should operate today. It requires integrity. They had immense integrity. That's my position, and I think that I'll listen to the rest of you from here on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And that is a wonderful book. And I will say that there's a great deal about our state of New York in there and the role that people played here and the importance of certain institutions like West Point. And one of the things I particularly appreciate that Tony Chaitkin brings out is the relationship also of culture, because it's not an accident that people involved in establishing West Point were creating opera companies in New York City, or the Baldwin guy was putting on Mozart's Magic Flute in Philadelphia. Because this is a question of what is your view of the nature of humanity, really. So I'm going to turn now to my colleague, Joel DeJean, and see what he has to say, and then we can open things up. Joel,
Thank you,
go ahead.
Diana. This is not just ancient history. I'll touch on something a little bit more recent. 20 years ago, yesterday, Enron Corporation went bankrupt. There was a real shock because Enron was at one time the seventh largest company in America, had billions of dollars in stock value, thousands of employees, and their chief executive, Kenneth Lay, was the key money bags for George W. Bush becoming governor of the state in 1994 and helped to finance his run for president in the year 2000. Now, Ken Lay's deputy, Jeffrey Skilling, went to Harvard Business School, MBA grad. He was infamous for saying during the height of the electricity crisis in California in the year 2000, 2001. He made the comparison between California and the Titanic. And he said the difference between California and the Titanic is that at least when the Titanic went down, the lights were still on, making fun of the fact that California was undergoing rolling blackouts due to the deregulation of the electric power industry, which was modeled on what Ken Lay and Enron did with their buddy George Bush here in Texas in 1999. Now, you think that with Enron being bankrupt, with their Ken Lay dying in 2006 after a humiliating trial, Jeffrey Skilling served prison time until about 2 years ago, you think that we would have learned the lesson. But no, last year in February, actually February of this year, due to the deregulation of the electricity market, the gas market, natural gas market, Texas underwent a almost week-long blackout of the entire state with millions of people living in the dark with no heat at a time due to global warming that we reached 16 degrees Fahrenheit here in Houston and even lower temperatures north of the state, the northern parts of the state. So we learned nothing from the bankruptcy of Enron, and the state legislature met this spring, and we took a couple of trips up there to tell them what to do to rewrite and to get rid of the renewables. Now, a lot of people think, well, the renewables, that's all for the Democrats, this Green New Deal. Well, it was George W. Bush and his deputies, like Rick Perry and the current governor, Greg Abbott, that built 11,000 wind turbines in West Texas, spent billions of dollars in transmission lines for electricity, and the wind turbines completely failed. Now, what's the backup for the wind turbines? It's the natural gas turbines. And because they skimp on maintenance and just winterizing basic steps, the natural gas turbines went offline. So we lost about a half hour power. So this is the result of free trade, deregulation, and the push for renewables, which is straight from Prince Charles and the British royal family. And this is what's being pushed at the summit that was held in Scotland just a few weeks ago. And this is what's being pushed on every third world nation, and it's being pushed all over Europe. So the ideas of the British Empire, free trade, deregulation, and most important, Malthusianism, is still alive and with us today. So part of my campaign and of Diane's campaign is to bring the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche and his four laws as a remedy to this sickness. This is worse than the virus. This sickness of British free trade and deregulation and this idea of environmentalism and Malthusianism. So I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So I would like, a couple of questions I would like us to take up is one, how did Americans get to be so confused about the British? And what can we do to reverse this? And Michael, I'd like to hear from you first, and also, your own thoughts on that question and what
Yes.
you are doing on it.
I don't think that most Americans are fooled by the British. It's I think the majority of Americans really could see that the British are not really our friends. I mean, let's look at it from all the wars. In World War I, we had there was a law. Subversion, that you could not say anything bad about the British or bad about the war. I mean, which is not the American way. It's not the First Amendment. The First Amendment is very clear. You could say whatever you want. Even saying yelling fire in a crowded movie theater is who doesn't stand up and look around to see if there's a fire or smoke? I mean, you really want to fool people. People basically have to want to be fooled first and foremost. And just like Hitler in Germany, and people say that, oh, you say a lie often enough, it becomes true. And that's not true, because the people have to believe it. They have to want to believe it. They have to also have someone who is of authority and respected not to say anything. The evil thrives when good men do nothing. This is the same thing. It's kind of a travesty. But you have to look at it, though. Most Americans don't are distrustful. Most Americans don't believe what they're told, and I'll leave it at that.
Although I think Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are awfully loved, and I'm very suspicious about what they're trying to do running around in New York these
Mm-hmm.
days. Some people think she may be considering running for office, but I don't know if she'd have to give
Possible.
up being a duchess.
Possible. It's she's an elitist,
Yeah,
and there's too many people that consider themselves elitist and call us deplorable and call us the smelly Walmart people. Don't care much for Walmart, but I can understand why people would. It's. I've had a friend of mine said to me, "Oh my God, there's a big disparity between the rich and the poor." And I said, "Well, you made it that way. You buy from Amazon. You're the one that stays on Facebook all day. You're the one that's funding the richer people, making them richer. Buy locally. It's the money is in your hands to choose who to spend it with." And well, he kind of agreed with me, but I don't know if he doesn't order from Amazon. I saw out in front of his house an Amazon box yesterday, so I don't know if my words fell on deaf ears.
right. Although I
Hopefully, he
think
ordered it before we spoke. So
right. Well, Chris, since he was saying so much about Tony's book, I think you may want to elaborate more. But that also does make a difference to have a policy that comes from the government. I mean, look, what Joel just went through with Enron, that's free trade, right? We deregulated electricity and we say, oh, we did it because competition is great. Well, then you discover that the competition is rigged because the same people are on the boards of all the companies that are allegedly competing with each other. And it's my sense that the government, people complain about big government. I actually think the government is loaded, especially the intelligence agencies, which have hundreds of thousands of people spying on us
it's a
all.
Leviathan government, yes.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
they're not big in terms of what they control. The government has largely abdicated. We're not enforcing anti-monopoly laws. We're not enforcing antitrust laws. We are sort of allowing these billionaires to get away with looting briefly. And I read something by Lyndon LaRouche the other morning, which was really striking to me from his platform that he wrote in 1999 when he was running for president in 2000, and he described hyperinflation, what we've seen with these bailouts and the continuous quantitative easing. And he said, in order to keep the bubble afloat, what you have to do ultimately is asset stripping. So you loot the things that actually are generating the productivity of your economy to feed this monstrous hyperinflation, and that at a certain point you just get to a shock where the whole thing collapses. And I think we're really at the cusp of this now, but this is part of what I wanted to get at, because many Americans think that our economy is supposed to be completely unregulated, or not wanting a big government means that there aren't supposed to be government regulations. The point of government is it's supposed to protect people from the vultures and the crooks and the people who think they can do whatever they want just because they manage to buy up
It's
everything.
not capitalism; it's crony capitalism. And when you get crony capitalism, like Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, I put a parallel between Malthusianism and Bill Gates very quickly. Um,
Mhm.
it's such a difficult thing to govern correctly, but that's why we have the filibuster that takes a long time to sign something into a law, and we have those laws, those anti-monopoly laws, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and a lot of the different regulations. When we deregulated Ma Bell, it was the best phone company in the world, but now we deregulated, and a lot of people made a lot of money. It spread the wealth. Not the same amount of people are rich as they were 20 years ago or even 50 years ago. Well, the Rockefellers and uh, they're still rich. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, they still have plenty of money, but they're being more quiet than they were back in the 50s.
Most of the money
Chris, what
from the stimulus has gone into the hands of the billionaires. In fact, the entire uh, inequality of wealth in the United States has been tremendously exacerbated by the stimulus. If they have gone
Yeah, I
to
agree.
defense contractors, the military, the friends of the in the government, it is really shocking what has happened. A
Mhm.
small amount has gone to local communities, but the vast
Yeah, they
majority
give
of it has
a
gone into
thousand
the
dollars, $2,000 to a regular person, and they're supposed to be happy with that.
yes,
Keep your $2,000 and let me earn a good wage.
precisely.
Earn a good wage.
That's
Don't
what we
hand me a good wage, because if you
exactly
hand
that.
me a good wage, what the hell am I want to work harder for to make a better wage?
Yes, yes. Well, we're
But the
hoping for
problem
a
is
change,
that
but
both.
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that the problem is that both political parties. I'll give you an example. A couple of weeks ago in the Congress, in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, the subcommittee, they went through some of the latest breakthroughs in fusion energy. And one of the scientists happened to be the head of Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, who happens to be a Brit. And the congressman leading the committee at the time praised them for being knighted by the Queen a few years ago. And both the Republicans and the Democrats were falling all over each other, calling the guy Sir Doctor or so and so. So the British hold over the politicians in this country. And I, I have to disagree with the American people. The American people watch the crown. They watch the royal weddings. They worship the royal family, and they tried to worship the royal family of the U.S., the Bush family, but they were too defective. So there is a sickness in this country, in the population, that they tolerate the British as some kind of powerless royalty. And that's why we have to educate them to the fact that the British power is still alive on Wall Street. And while their
The power,
401k
yeah,
might have gone up, but it's going to crash just like anything else.
yeah. The desire of something for nothing has always been present, but I don't think that that idea has the same power as what Tony Chaikin mentions in this book. This is extremely important. It is the possible saving of the United States. It, it not alone who did it, how they did it, the slavery and the the totalitarianism that they were fighting for, the same kind of, in fact, it's identical to what we are facing today. And brave men and women stood up and they defeated it. They made the American system work. And it's in this book how it was done, how it can be done today, and how therefore how the American system can be taken back from the banksters, the British, and the globalists.
Yeah, Chris, I agree with you 100%. There's a big percentage of American people look at the British royalty as godlike, but a bigger majority, I think, sees through that. I mean, they use it as entertainment, and it's fine. There's a television show on, and maybe you've watched it. It's called Almost Royal. They poke so much fun at the British royalty, and it's all true. I mean, you can see what they do. It's so difficult to convince those people, a small percentage of the people, that we're not being controlled by their type of economy. And the American economy, which is not free and open market, but it's not the crony capitalism that is promoted by the British economy or type of
It's
economy.
gone a long way. It's gone a long way in that direction. It's got to be pulled back from that direction. But go
Well,
ahead.
it's our job. That's our job.
That's
Yes.
right. I mean, I
Yes.
think we have to get back to what Lyndon LaRouche's breakthrough was the figuring out the relationship between human creativity and economic prosperity, and not in terms of money. That is his metric. Ultimately, you could say, are you making it possible for future generations to be more populous, to have more people who have a higher standard of living, measured by things like life expectancy, level of education, reduction of
Yes.
infant mortality. These actual parameters, I mean, if we're not all crazy egomaniacs, we should want the next generation to actually be better than we are, right? To be smarter,
Exactly.
to be
Exactly.
kinder,
Yes.
to have more Beethovens and Einsteins and,
Yes.
cure diseases and things like that. But I think part of this
You sound like
cultural,
Stephen. You sound like Jordan Peterson.
well, part of the cultural shift is we've shrunk in what we expect, and I see it in New York all the time. I went to
Every day.
a Crane's business, whatever, on the situation with the subways. Because, as you know, particularly in 2017, it reached a new low where you had fires on the subway all the time and people were always late and the trains would break down. And we'll have more of that soon since they shut down Indian Point and they shut down the gas fired plants that are supposed to replace it. But so what were they discussing at this, how to fix the subways and how to rebuild Penn Station and this and that? Everything they were proposing was based on the assumption that the population will not increase. So everything that they are proposing will be obsolete before it's even built. And we're living, as people know, all over the country with sewer systems and pipes that are over a century.
Well over a
Is it?
century in New York City. Yeah, I'm an
Yeah.
engineer, so and I
Oh,
know,
okay.
and I work with New York City Water and Sewer. I own patents on water reclamation systems that I use all over the world, but they're basically for reusing water for washing things. But yeah, we have a real problem with the city sanitary sewer system, and we don't have a sewer septic sewer wash water. Like our water that goes from high rainstorms and high deluges goes into our systems that actually is supposed to clean it, and we don't have a storm sewer that sends it right out into the bay. And that's
Exactly.
a big problem when you have these 5 inch an hour rainstorms. It's a deluge, and
Exactly.
um, then you get the sewerage just goes out in there. And then in the summertime, when you have a big heavy rain, they put alerts to the beaches. You can't go swimming, and it's how long does that last? And they test it every hour, and the health department comes in, and it's then they start putting chemicals into the water. But as far as you can see with the subways, I see the most continuous way they want to fix the subways and spend more monies on the subways is taxing the cars. But no one wants to ride the subways. It's a vicious circle. Everybody's buying cars in New York City. Prices of cars
Well,
were really
but
cheap for a long time.
they aren't going to be able to drive in New York City soon
But yeah,
because
but you're
we'll
going to
all
have
be
congestion pricing like in London, and who's
right.
following that? That was
Well, I know.
it's such a no one's thinking about it long term. No one's thinking about it even not even long term. No one's thinking about it for 20 years. I'll be here 20 years from now, and I'm going to point out what they did wrong and what I said should have been done.
Good.
But
Now,
even with our
after this,
electrical grid in New York City, it's horrible.
I know.
My
After
degree
this
is in
talk,
electrical engineering, so
okay, good. I want to speak with you separately about these matters. It's very important to me. Now, Chris, we had a question come in about the role of the Irish in the American Revolution. And I know one of the things that came up as we were, among other myths, as we were organizing for this symposium, people said that the Irish weren't very significant.
oh,
Would you
that's
like
not
to
true.
say
Yes.
something?
Well,
Chris,
they certainly weren't significant in Ireland because they had been stripped of legal personhood for centuries, and that is the definition of a slave. When you don't have legal personhood, you do not have access to a court except as a defendant. You cannot sue. You cannot own property because any crime perpetrated against you is not a crime because you have to be a human, a legal person, to suffer a crime. So they were again stripped of legal personhood and were turned into slaves. However, by the time of the Holocaust in Ireland, and I use the word Holocaust advisedly, it was reported as Holocaust starting on May the 4th, 1846, and was continually reported as Holocaust until November 19th, 1855, and was also written about as Holocaust throughout those years and later. That has been subsumed or adopted by others. But in any event, Benjamin Franklin visited Ireland in 1771, and there was a letter from the Viceroy in Ireland to London. At that time, until fairly recently, the British did run Ireland. They ran it from London and from Dublin. The Viceregal Lodge is in Phoenix Park, Dublin, and he complained to London that Benjamin Franklin was creating mischief among the Irish in Ireland. He attended the Dungannon Convention, and he encouraged the local ascendancy. The ascendancy were the Church of Ireland, that's the Anglican Church, the state church, to include the Irish in their militia. And he got them to actually abandon the word militia, because that was the landlord's use, the English landlord's use of their private military. And he had got them to adopt the phrase or the word volunteers. So they remained as volunteers for some years until after the defeat of General Cornwallis on November 19th, 1781 in Yorktown, Virginia. And he was, while his army went down to St. Lucia to lick their wounds, he went back to Britain, and they sent him over to Ireland immediately, where he took his vengeance upon the people of Ireland for having been such a large component of Washington's army in the new United States. So he, as the Viceroy in Ireland in his time, and also the head of the armed forces, he ginned up a rebellion against, committed atrocities such that the Irish had to rebel. And he then murdered some 25 or 30,000 more of them in 1798. And they were sent as slaves. Many survivors were sent as slaves in 1798 down to the Caribbean to slavery there. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of the situation of the Irish. So they did play a large role. Henry Carey, the fathers Carey and son Carey, were immensely important here. But the Irish formed mostly, and of course there were so many others, but the Irish formed largely the grunts, the riflemen on the ground, pikemen, some of them, on the ground, struggling along. Thomas Paine was their cheerleader. I don't think that the Americans would have won if it weren't for Thomas Paine. But strange, after the American win, he went to France, where he encouraged more of the same there. And even though there was a semi-revolution, he was locked up, and he wrote to President Washington at the time, and Washington did not support him. He was very lucky to not have been executed by the French. What he wrote here was the Sunshine Soldier and I can't remember the exact, but The Rights of Man was the book that got the French to rise, and it almost cost him his life. He later came to the United States, Thomas Paine, where he was essentially persona non grata, very sad to say, and he died and was buried in Virginia. William Cobbett, the British parliamentarian that I mentioned to you, came to the States specifically to bring the remains of Thomas Paine back to England, where he was born, in order to give him a proper monument and respectful memorial. But he died, and the remains of Thomas Paine have disappeared. But however, there's a main mountain peak down in southern Argentina, Pico Paine, Paine, for Thomas Paine. Oddly enough, he's more respected, it seems, in Argentina today than he is in the United States, where he should be considered one of our founding fathers. I'm out.
Okay.
Well, you're right that the Maryland 500 were all Irish, and they covered Washington's escape from Brooklyn into Manhattan, and were killed to the man and would not surrender. So this 30,000 armada of troops and boats and such from the British were stopped for a good period of time by the Maryland 500, which were all Irish.
I didn't
Could
know
you
that.
say something, Michael, more about the prison ships? Because I think a lot of people in New York, they go by that monument regularly. They don't think about it. They don't realize how many people died.
Well, the official record is 11,500 died, were either killed by the British, died of disease, or starvation. Not all of them were New Yorkers. A lot of them were Spanish merchant ships that didn't get the message that they were taken over by the British and they were put in the prison ships. And a lot of other people, other than soldiers, a lot of civilians. Like if the British um, felt they were cheated in a brothel or a gambling hall, they would round up 10, 20 able-bodied men. Now, you got to remember, able-bodied men then were from like 14 to 60. And they would put him in this prison ship. And it was a death sentence. You died fairly quickly. You were chained to someone who had typhoid. The guy on the other side, the British purposely gave them smallpox, which there was a vaccine, believe it or not, for smallpox, which was devised from cowpox. And they could have given them the injection of the vaccine and they would have lived. But that's not what they did. They let the British were the unusually and horribly cruel to Americans. Again, they looked upon Americans like they looked upon Irish, that they didn't have they were not persons. They were less than a person. They couldn't own property. They had to pay their taxes. That was for sure. If the British Army wanted to squat in their abode or their house, they had to either move out or even serve them food. It was a horrible situation that it was inevitable that the Americans who were living there were going to arise against them. Now, I hear different stories about less than 3% of the American population of the colonies at that time took up arms against the British. But it was a huge amount of people that supported them in a support role with food and arms and horses and guns and everything they could get. Like, again, the British had the best firearm that you could get. The Brown Bess was the best firearm at the time. The Americans had squirrel guns and shotguns and such. It was only till the French started supporting the Americans that the Washington's army had some better armaments and better cannons, and what they stole from the British, what they would take from the British in different places, Syracuse and Lake
when Lord
Champlain.
Cornwall when Lord Cornwall went back to Britain and then was made commander in chief of the British forces in Ireland and the Viceroy, the British Viceroy. Here's a little ditty. It was early in the spring. The birds did whistle and sweetly sing, changing their notes from tree to tree, and the song they sang was Old Ireland Free. It was early in the night. The yeoman cavalry gave me a fright. The yeoman cavalry were my downfall, and taken was I by Lord Cornwall. One of the sad kind of events that must have occurred to hundreds of thousands at the time. But Cornwall took out, he certainly exacted his vengeance upon the Irish. A few years after, his sword was surrendered in Yorktown in 1781.
Yeah, well, Americans were not allowed to have a saber. You were put to death if they were caught with a saber. The bayonet that the British had on the ends of their guns was a triangular bayonet, which the Geneva Convention had outlawed because it's unrepairable. Once you get stabbed with that triangle bayonet, you would bleed out in horrible pain. There's no way to repair that wound. So the British invented all these horrible weapons. The British came up with draw and quartering, if you know what that is, where you take each one of your limbs at your hands and feet, tie each one of them to a horse with a stable rope, and you beat the horse till it and then you till the arms and legs of the person come off. And also they come up with keel hauling. Keel hauling is you put a
Yeah,
rope under the ship and
yeah.
up the other side, and you drag a person from one side port to starboard or starboard to port. You know, the commander of the ship would call it, and no one survived that. It was a brutal, horrible thing. The barnacles on the bottom of the ship would cut the person to ribbons, and sharks would usually get them. And so the British would usually do that in shark-infested waters anyway. You know, the British were
It's
horrible
probably,
in
yes, it's
in
probably important to say that the average English person probably even then was okay. Their system is what we must defeat. The royal system, it is corrupting the world, and I'm afraid that we have lost. That the American system has lost a lot of ground to the English system in the last few
yes.
decades of this country.
Yeah, I
Chris, I
think
think
you're
the
Well,
book you're
right.
but the
talking
good
about is
news is they're
Summertime
going
Soldier.
bankrupt.
Wait, go ahead,
The
Joel.
British.
And Joel,
Yeah,
yeah,
the
Joel,
whole
Joel,
British Wall Street system. Yeah, the whole British Wall Street system is bankrupt, and the bailouts are only kicking. But I would say the best gift that the Irish gave to America was Kennedy, who gave the American people inspiration to go to the moon and gave us a spin-offs of that Apollo mission for the last 60 years. And what LaRue tried to revive is that idea of American technological optimism. But we revive. We don't have to worry about beating the British system. It's ready. We have to just bury it. But we do have to revive the American system, which is represented by things like the Apollo mission.
Yes, and we've got to
Yeah, well,
take science back from the bankers and the politicians, and make it real science again. The American system
make it
was
real
based
science.
on true science.
right.
On
That's
my
right.
on my degree, it says um, a degree in applied science of electrical engineering. So when I talk about global warming, and they say, "Well, you're not a scientist," I go, "I certainly am," and thank you for saying that because everybody that observes anything and takes a record of it is a scientist because you observe it the next day and the next day, and then that's how science works.
Yeah.
Galileo Galilei had no degree from a high educational facility. You don't have to have a degree or PhD to be a scientist. So our scientists are afraid, our good scientists are petrified of speaking out of turn and being shut down or canceled. So we have to do something to stop the cancel culture. But I think that's falling apart on its own already. You'll see some of the higher
Beginning to, yes.
celebrities and the smarter
Yes,
celebrities are
it
turning
is.
around and saying that, hey, this is not the way to handle things. And the scientists that have a little more gumption are coming up and saying, I don't want to be buried. I don't want to be canceled. I refuse to be canceled. And we should all refuse to be canceled, you know. And something that I heard just recently is that if you have something to say that's pertinent to the conversation and you don't say it, that is as good as a lie. Because, like I said before, if you're not standing up and saying that something is a lie and it's not right, the more someone repeats it and you say nothing, it's going to be believed. Because a lot of people will look at me and say, "Oh, is that true?" I say, "Absolutely not." But if I said nothing, I realize if I said nothing, they would go along with the lie. And this is what happened in Nazi Germany. This is what happened in Franco's Spain. This is what happened in Italy. This is what happened in with Pol Pot. This is what happened with Chairman Mao. This is what happened with Stalin. They were all afraid to say anything. Our First Amendment is the most important amendment. And what did Dave Chappelle say? The Second Amendment's there in case the First Amendment doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
Well, a lot
Now,
of the
I think
braver
that's,
scientists are working with us. Go ahead, Diane.
yes, they are. No, I would like to wrap up because we're sort of over time, and there's a couple announcements I want to make, and I also have a comment from someone listening who says, "Don't forget the contribution of more technologically advanced Kentucky rifles made in Pennsylvania by the Germans." They say
This is true. This is true.
they,
They learned how to put a turn and a half in that inside of the barrel, and they did it
right.
using a rock and a cable, a
Yeah.
wire.
Great. So
Yeah.
now let me just say a couple things on this truth question, because look, there's a huge fraud that's about to occur. I put out a statement because in the state of New York, as people may or may not know, some pretty wild things were done. Happily, the referenda on the ballot to allow everybody to register and vote the same day, and some of these things were defeated quite overwhelmingly, actually.
Yes,
But
the
there
trap.
were new rules slipped into the budget that mean if you're not with the Democratic or Republican Party, if you're running independent in a statewide race, as I am, instead of 15,000 signatures to get on the ballot, I need 45,000 valid signatures to get on the ballot, and they have to be collected in a 6-week period, which is a
Wow.
virtual impossibility. So this is quite a fraud. And I wrote a statement at the suggestion of Helga Zeppler-Rouche, because there is a summit coming up being sponsored by the Biden administration and the US State Department called the Summit for Democracy, which many people around the world are ridiculing right now, particularly the Russians and the Chinese are ridiculing because they were not invited, but Taiwan was, which is not supposed to be recognized by the United States according to agreements that Nixon made when he opened up China. That's a red line that we're stepping on. Ukraine was invited, where we funded a coup and put a bunch of people in power who are wearing swastikas on their uniforms and things like that. So Russia and China were excluded. We've declared that Juan Guaido is our chosen president of Venezuela, even though that wasn't the choice of the population there. I mean, it's pretty bizarre. The Russians made a point about what happened on January 6th in the United States and the fact that we have still dozens of people in solitary confinement who have not even been tried for crimes that they were accused of, like trespassing. Um, and they are looking at the fact that our news media seems to be terribly controlled, our social media seems to be terribly controlled. And we have the situation that I mentioned, where in the state of New York, they're trying to make sure that anybody and their brother and their mother and their aunt and their ancestor from the American Revolution can vote, but there will be only one candidate on the ballot. So this is something that really has to be addressed and has to be changed. And I think Americans would do well to reflect upon how we are seen by the rest of the world, because there are certain things that we may like to deny, like the incredible poverty in some of our cities, the takedown of our industry, the shape of our roads. But this is obvious to anyone who comes here and visits the country. Furthermore, our conduct, our engagement in these illegal wars based on lies, largely from the British, our great so-called allies. And I will point out that 76 years ago, the end of World War II, is not such a long time ago. Uh, the nations that we are claiming are the biggest threat to us, namely China and Russia, were our allies in defeating fascism in Europe and Asia. So how is it now that they're supposedly the leading enemies, but the British Empire explicitly, and I don't mean the English people, but this outlook, the people who still call themselves Global Britain and hold summits in Glasgow, Scotland, where they want to shut down everyone's right to electricity, uh, are considered our greatest allies. This really has to be thought about. And to that end, I would like to just announce tomorrow at 1 o'clock, the Schiller Institute will be holding a conference on the urgent necessity that every nation on the planet has a right to a modern health system. Because the one thing that you do see with the pandemic is you cannot simply say that a more prosperous nation is going to be able to vaccinate people or have modern hospitals or give people care, and who cares what happens in Africa or India or some place where people are impoverished, that if you do that, you will get, as LaRouche warned 50 years ago, new forms of pandemic. If we sit back and allow 23 million people to starve to death in Afghanistan, that will become a likely breeding ground of new diseases and terrorism and so on. So therefore, it is in the interest of mankind that nations collaborate to elevate the conditions of mankind as a whole. And the most obvious way to start on that is on the question right now of health care, and not simply vaccines, which people are getting very focused about one way or the other, but other questions like clean drinking water, decent nutrition, electricity. We give a lot of, at least there's a lot of lip service about quote unquote hardening the grid, but what about hardening the grid of human well-being? And if we were to make this a priority, believe me, this amount of money we've been pumping into these crazy bailouts, or this $130 trillion that they claim they're going to spend on enforcing shutting down all of our fossil fuels, could be much better spent on building the infrastructure that's needed worldwide. And I think people would become much more happy and prosperous if we were engaged in something for the good. So that's tomorrow. There'll be a panel of doctors and other experts on matters of public health and infrastructure at with also Helga Zepp-LaRouche at 1:00 at the Schiller Institute. So I'd encourage people to tune into that. I also would like to encourage people to sign up and volunteer for my campaign. We are fighting, perhaps there is a good possibility of reversing this outrageous move in the budget to make it impossible, or nearly so, for people who are not part of the establishment to get on the ballot. But we still are going to have to get a bunch of signatures, whether it's 15,000 or 45,000. And we're also going to need to target the legislature starting as early as next week, when we may have a bill introduced to reverse this. So please sign up at sareforsenate.com. And if we could have everyone back, Jose, for a minute, I'd really like to thank all of you very much for participating. I hope we'll be working together.
Can I just say one
Yes.
thing? Is that it's not even constitutional to be able to do that. It's a violation of the voting laws. And also, where did this ranked voting come from? I mean, I never voted for it. Did you? Did anybody
No.
vote for ranked voting here in New York City? And
No,
I
they
think you're
just
talking about more than global health. I think the first and easiest thing to do, and people will do it themselves, is global wealth. Poor people want to make themselves rich. They do. And they have beneath their feet the means to do it. Fossil fuel. That's all.
Okay. Well, thank you. I hope you
But
can
the
turn
British
into.
are trying to make that illegal. Diane, I would say
So is the
one
United
thing
States
that
government.
Okay,
right,
Joel.
right. The
Go
one
ahead,
thing that
Joel.
would make the state legislature of New York maybe think of themselves as shameful idiots is to tell them that the ballot access in Texas is much more liberal, and it seems that Texas is much more pro-choice
I might be moving to
than
Texas
ballot
soon.
access than New York.
Either Texas or Florida. I have friends in both states.
Right.
They want me
And
to
I
move out of
saw
Brooklyn.
Chris, right, Chris promoting Tony Chaitkin's book. So, look, thank you again very much. We
Thank
have
you.
quite a
Thank you
bit
very
ahead of
much for
us,
having me.
and I
Thank
hope
you
we're
all.
all going to work together on
Absolutely.
saving
Anytime.
civilization.
Good luck
Okay.
to all who are running. Good luck to you in your election efforts.
Thank you so much.